Hello, my dear friends. Here we are, day 10 of our Advent midweek devotions. You got a special one today. Actually, today is part 1 of 2. There's too much good stuff in the text for today. We'll have to continue it tomorrow. So we'll talk about part 1 today. If you remember yesterday, we talked about Samuel and how God's people, the Israelites, came to Samuel and said they wanted a king like everybody else, like all the other nations around them. Samuel talked to God. God told Samuel to go ahead and give them a king, that God's people were really rejecting God as their king. And so Samuel does. He anoints Saul at first to be king over the Israelites, and then later he anoints David to be king. Time passes. Lots of stories in there between about David and between David and Saul and what happens. But I want to get to a high point in David's reign. Under David, God's people experience a period of peace finally. It's the golden age of Israel. David is the ideal king, it seems. And we go to 2 Samuel chapter 7. And there reaches a point in David's reign where verse 1 talks about after the king was settled in his palace, the Lord had given him rest from his enemies. David sort of thinks, what's next? What do I do now? And so he has an idea. You see, David lived in a beautiful palace. There was peace in the nation. And yet the Ark of the Covenant, that place where God said he was going to dwell, is still that tent, that tabernacle that had been put together back in the desert many, many years before. David recognized the inequity of that situation and thought, I'm going to build a permanent place, a permanent temple where the Ark of the Covenant can be held, a permanent place for God's people to worship. So he tells Nathan the prophet this is what he's going to do. Nathan says, go for it. Except that Nathan receives a vision that night, and God speaks to Nathan a message for David. And the message is that it's not David's place to build the temple. That it's not his job, David's job, to build that temple. Instead, this is what God says through the prophet Nathan. 2 Samuel chapter 7, going down to the second half of verse 11 or so. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. Skip down a little bit. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. David isn't going to do God any favors by building this temple. Instead, God is going to do David the favor. And God is going to establish David's dynasty. His offspring, his children are going to rule over Israel, not just for a few years, but God promises forever. God establishes this family line. And indeed, as you follow through the rest of the Old Testament, for a long time, for centuries, David's descendants continue to rule over Israel. Things don't always go well. The nation eventually divides into two, but still that family line endures. But of course, ultimately, what this is talking about is that one who is going to reign, who is descended from David, named Jesus. The wise men come looking for the one who is to be king of Israel. Jesus is enthroned on the cross. Behold, the King of the Jews, the sign above his dying body. And it's why the gospel writers take pains to trace Jesus' genealogy all the way back, at least to David, if not farther, to Abraham and to Adam and Eve, to establish that Jesus is the one fulfilling this dynasty, who is the king descended from David, who is the rightful heir that God promised back here in 2 Samuel, that God promised to David, that through Jesus, David's kingdom, David's kingship is established forever. Jesus is God's king. Jesus is the king over God's people eternally. The house is established. But is that all that's going on here? We're going to talk about another aspect of this same verse tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. God be with you.